Great, thank you very much. So in the philanthropic sector, we see, we examined 5 different technologies for the sector using a discourse analysis that focuses on the stories that circulate about these tools via product websites, marketing materials, and news articles. We surface these texts' implicit and explicit visions about the near future of philanthropy, and inspired by the recent scholarship of Richmond Wong at UC Berkeley, we analyze these visions as design fictions. We argue that these visions about the near future cultivate both unrealistic anticipatory relationships to the present and unrealistic imperatives for the sector. At a big picture level, we believe that our work points to the crucial role of HCI scholars in not just redesigning tools for philanthropy, but also in working to disrupt impossible futures that design often promises. So for a bit of context, Amy and Ellie are my co-authors on this paper, have been doing HCI research in the nonprofit space since about 2009. And in addition to my current research, which is also in that space, I've also worked as a nonprofit IT professional. So between the 3 of us, we have a fair amount of experience observing philanthropic organizations and working with organizations using, not using, and most often struggling with all different kinds of information technologies. There's quite a bit of scholarship in HCI and related communities that's drawn attention to the numerous challenges that nonprofits face in adopting and leveraging new computing tools. But in this paper, we're not kind of starting with that analysis of use. Instead, here, our inspiration for this project was kind of a related observation that even in the face of all of these challenges, people and organizations in the nonprofit sector often are maintaining optimistic relationships to new technology, often locating the blame for errors on themselves rather than the technology. People like Max, who's quoted here, lamented to us that he wished we, meaning his organization, used technology a little bit better. And even as we saw all the ways that technology break down in the philanthropic sector, nonprofit workers repeatedly expressed beliefs that technology could be better used, that it would be beneficial if deployed, that some new tool really ought to be adopted, or that IT should be leveraged in some new useful way. So we were confronted by this kind of paradox in which the breakdowns of the technology were coupled with this pervasive rhetoric of optimism, and a sense that technology adoption was in some way a moral imperative, no less a sign of a good organization. So interrogating this paradox is what really inspired the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today. We set out to shed light on several different questions. What kinds of promises about philanthropic IT circulate in marketing materials, product websites, and news articles? What implicit assumptions are these texts making about things like how social good is accomplished, how philanthropic organizations are and might be more effective, to whom organizations should be accountable, and what the terms of that accountability should be? And then also, how do these text stories hold together? How do they fall apart? And finally, what's admitted in their visions of the near future? So as I've mentioned in the paper, we talk through 5 different product-centered case studies. And in the interest of time today, I'm only going to be talking through 2, but of course, I'd encourage you to check out the paper for information on the rest. So after I go over those 2 case studies, I'm going to talk a bit about the implications of this work for the CHI community. The 2 case studies I've chosen to talk about today include Charity Navigator, which is a well-known and long-established, quote, guide to intelligent giving, and HandUp, a newer San Francisco-based tech startup offering, quote, direct giving for the homeless and others at risk. So if you aren't already familiar, Charity Navigator is a prominent charity rating website. And when their site went live in 2002, they claimed to be the largest independent charity evaluating service in the world. To potential donors, they offer an easy-to-understand 0 to 4-star system to help individual donors make decisions about where to direct their funds. Charity Navigator began as a response to its funders' anxieties about the scandalous misuse of funds by some charities, sometimes even those that were, quote, household names that people assumed did good work. By helping donors to make better informed decisions and avoid the so-called fake charities, Charity Navigator aims to, quote, advance a more efficient and responsive philanthropic marketplace. Today, Charity Navigator's ratings exert significant influence in the sector, with nonprofit workers describing their organization's rating as, quote, absolutely critical to attract new resources and donors. Yet these simple and easy to understand 0 to 4-star systems have long been based only on two dimensions of organizational performance, so financial and accountability and transparency. Serving as a proxy for organizational worthiness, these metrics have been criticized by nonprofit organizations as punishing not just fake charities, but also many legitimate organizations. According to an article in the Nonprofit Quarterly, the use of overhead as a primary proxy has always been intensely flawed and has brought unfortunate consequences. Organizations have starved themselves of necessary infrastructure in a misguided attempt to fit a single formula. So in the last year, Charity Navigator has begun revamping its metrics. By altering the mathematical formula used in their ratings, they claim to now allow for a greater range of administrative expenses. In the future, they promise even better metrics to remedy the flaws in current rankings, all without losing the simplicity of that 0 to 4-star system. Charity Navigator envisions a future in which transparency and accountability, operationalized unproblematically in a 0 to 4-star system, will facilitate better philanthropic outcomes. So rather than being swindled by fake charities or wasting money on inefficient ones, donors can direct their money to places where their dollar will have the most real impact. At the other end of the spectrum is a San Francisco-based tech startup called HandUp. The organization is primarily centered around a homelessness-specific crowdfunding site, which the Wall Street Journal described as a Kickstarter for the homeless. Rather than foregrounding existing philanthropic organizations, HandUp's mission statement roots the technology company itself in a direct moral obligation to, quote, do something about the problems we see in the world and leverage technology and the power of human relationships to fight urban poverty. In Silicon Valley fashion, HandUp aims to disrupt the space of poverty solutions directly. The transformative power of computing means that, quote, new solutions to poverty are within our reach. Given that poverty still exists, despite years of work by existing organizations, implies that the existing intervention strategies are fundamentally broken. As explained in a Forbes article celebrating the uber-cool HandUp, they offer a high-tech alternative to panhandling for spare change. So instead, quote, people in need create a crowdfunding profile which has been, quote, verified by a local nonprofit, and then the individual, as a person walks by, gives that the potential donor a card with the URL to their crowdfunding site. And since the donation goes to the nonprofit, as opposed to the individual, donors can be 100% certain that the money will be applied to, quote, removing obstacles which are keeping the person in poverty, and that it is, quote, properly spent. And I should note that whenever I say quote, I'm pulling directly from the marketing materials or the website. So the future envisioned in HandUp centers on a promise of increased directedness and a way for donors to see your impact. Technology will transform the space to ensure funds are properly spent, though this is not accomplished by reaching for a new solution, but rather by introducing themselves as a new intermediary in the long-established and supposedly broken charity process. So going back to the beginning of the talk, I shared some of the broader kind of inspirations for this research, the pattern of could, shoulds, oughts, and woulds. And so in addition to HandUp and Charity Navigator, each of the IT systems that we examined in the paper draws out facets of how philanthropy ought to be carried out in the future. Yet while anticipatory in character, these texts claim to be telling a story about what is possible in the present. After all, the tools are available for purchase today on their website. The present, however, is always imperfect and in need of augmentation and improvement. The promise of the current tool manifests instead as an ideal near future, a temporal distance that is perpetually out of reach. It is in this tension between the impossible present and the unreachable near future that we argue the could, shoulds, and oughts of our many prior discussions materialize. So in the paper, we more thoroughly interrogate these intertwined promises of the various tools and kind of reflect on the series of disconnects between their visions of the future and the realities of philanthropy and IT. But in closing, I want to touch on some of the tropes in which Charity Navigator and HandUp are at least partially implicated. A future is envisioned where bigger and stronger communities are realized through technical capacities for connecting people with each other, with causes, and with information. Yet the work to establish, grow, and sustain these communities goes unacknowledged in these visions of friction-free futures. A future is envisioned where increased transparency, accountability, and measurement lead to bigger and better impact. Yet performance metrics that discount the value of spending money on technical infrastructure and administration undermine organizations' abilities to live up to the very reporting that these metrics demand. So when rating agencies like Charity Navigator look to nonprofits to provide ever more details about their operations, they simultaneously penalize these same organizations for spending resources on anything like technology that is not clearly in direct service of their mission. A future is envisioned where philanthropy is more successful because it is easier to do. Good design and convenient tools break down barriers to participation. Yet while HandUp's gift cards may be easier for the public, nonprofits find themselves with yet another system to manage and, quote, take advantage of. And finally, a future is envisioned where longstanding social issues in which philanthropy has aimed to intervene are finally brought to an end, thanks to a new innovation that finally harnesses the transformative power of computing to bring about the change that has eluded prior approaches. The great irony of HandUp as a, quote, innovative tool is that it ultimately works through existing social service organizations and through the provision of basic charity. Yet it creates new processes, new mediators, and new overhead for these organizations. Ultimately, these and other technological promises for the philanthropic sector cannot be fully realized by users in the socio-technical context in which they live. Yet these design fictions prime users with unrealistic expectations of what computing can do and contributes to a continual sense of inadequacy and leads to a continual state of churn. So if we as a community want to be user advocates, then we must find new ways to intervene in the crafting of these technological narratives and in the over-promising of technological interventions. We have an ethical obligation to resist the narratives of technological quick fixes and to offer political support for non-use. We must acknowledge that new technologies will undoubtedly create their own new problems, overheads, and things to work around. Sometimes we might best advocate for users by working to destabilize the false promises of technology rather than attempting to craft better promises. Through the tools that we design, the research we publish, and the courses that we teach, we must convey more realistic presence and more realistic futures that do not overindulge in unbridled optimism. So before I wrap up and take questions, I just want to briefly mention a paper that I presented earlier in the week, Disempowered by Data, that's kind of related to this area, kind of looking more at the various actors that are influencing, in particular, the data systems in the nonprofit and social enterprise space. And also, I'd like to take a moment to thank Vera, Wendy, and our anonymous reviewers for their feedback, as well as National Science Foundation and University of Colorado Boulder for their support. And I'd be happy to take questions. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, Wally Smith, University of Melbourne. So yeah, thanks, that's great. I just wondered if there's something special about philanthropy here, because much of what you're saying could be applied to the selling of large business systems to organisations, but always undermine the present and yet appeal to an impossible future. So do you think philanthropy's got a particular twist on this, or is it an IT salesperson problem?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I thought about that. My wife actually does research on advertising, and you know, I think that's probably not a unique aspect to philanthropy. Any technology company is going to market their products and upsell them or present them in a very positive